Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and the patrons on Patreon voted for which state I would cover involving their admission into the Union. In fact, the election was tied between Mississippi and Iowa. Therefore, I took it upon myself to choose. As you could tell from the thumbnail and the title, I chose Iowa, just because it was probably the least known about when it comes to statehood. I hope you all enjoy. In the early 1800s, the area soon to be known as Iowa was a vast prairie nestled along the Mississippi River, which only boosted its appeal to early settlers. Pioneers began settling the states of Indiana and Illinois, and in the pursuit of more land, they began to cross the Mississippi River. One of the first significant purchases of land in what would become Iowa was the Black Hawk Purchase in 1832, Black Hawk being the chief of the Sauk Indian tribe. The deal was brokered by General Winfield Scott and Governor of Illinois John Reynolds at present-day Davenport. Black Hawk was held prisoner as the details of the purchase were worked out. It resulted in the gaining of 6 million acres of land for Euro-Americans. The Euro-Americans who flooded into the newly gained territory went about setting aside farms and writing to their families in the east, describing the luscious prairie and the easily cultivated ground. This brought in an influx of not only Americans but Europeans to the Iowa Territory. So many people came into the state that the territorial governor, Robert Lucas, asked Congress to consider its admission into the Union in 1839. He argued that the title of state would bring about more prosperity to the area and help people economically. However, Congress disagreed. They said that such a young territory needed time to grow before heavy taxation from a state government stepped in and hindered its growth. They advised to wait a few years until families and farmers could get on their 2 feet before making it a state. Both the governor and Congress was right in their own way. Becoming a state came with a lot of political and economic benefits, but creating a state too early could dampen the resolve of many of the settlers. The two parties that dominated the political scene in that period of American history were the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs hoped to hold off statehood because they believed the territory would go more democratic. The Democrats wanted to bring about statehood for that very reason. However, the people, or adult white male population, would need to agree to a constitutional convention to create a state constitution to be submitted to Congress, so the debate within the territory became about taxation and the benefits of becoming a state. A state received money from the federal government for internal improvements, and although women could not vote, Democrats appealed to the mothers of that territory by stating that a state government could allocate funds for schools for their children to attend and receive an education. A state could use federal dollars to dredge rivers for steamboat travel or build roads to get goods to market. This is a unique case of the political parties in a way going against their own party platform. Democrats of this time generally did not approve of federal dollars going to the states for internal improvements. That was a Whig platform, but both sides were concerned about the other gaining power in Congress. Ultimately, the people of the Iowa Territory decided to hold off on calling a convention. The governor of the Iowa Territory from 1841 to 1845 was John Chambers, an anti-Jacksonian Whig. In 1844, he called a convention together to create a state constitution. The delegates met in Iowa City on October 7th of that year. Their first order of business was to decide whether the convention should begin with a prayer. After a heated discussion, the resolution was postponed. Eventually, it would be declared that it would not be economical, for the convention sat at an expense of $200 to $300 per day, and time was money. To pass a resolution to have prayer was compelling men to listen to what they were opposed to, and violated one of the inalienable rights of men. So to save money, time, and to prevent the setting of a precedent that could lead a state to attempting to establish an official religion of that state and violate the Constitution, they decided not to have prayer. The next issue was slavery. The Missouri Compromise over 20 years earlier had established that slavery would not exist above the 3630 parallel, so the delegates contemplated how would African Americans be treated if they came into the state. It was possible that a slave owner could take up residence in Iowa and bring his slaves. If that happens, what would be the outcome? The natural thought would be that since they were in a free state, that the slave would be a free resident or citizen of the state. But that got into topics that many of the delegates did not want to consider, like giving African American males any civil rights within the state, and that would naturally follow if they were considered citizens of that state. One delegate insisted that if they gave African American males rights, then they may even have to give women or even children civil rights like voting or improved legal standing. So the discussion regarding civil rights was foregone. The other two issues were some of the most important to the political parties of the time: banking and education. Ever since the Panic of 1819 and the financial crisis in 1837, Americans had a suspicion of banks. The mishandling of funds could ruin a community, state, or country. Therefore, the convention agreed that they needed a public bank to ensure a stable foundation for borrowing money, but they needed to put tight restrictions on that bank to ensure that it did not get involved in corrupt business practices. As spoken about earlier, education was an important issue. The Democrats, who attempted to woo Iowan mothers with the ideas about public education, were involving themselves in a significant issue. Many of the settlers to Iowa were from the Northeast, which had a Puritan foundation of valuing education. Therefore, many of the delegates pushed for expanded education to the children of Iowa. The convention established a superintendent of public instruction to oversee education in the state. They allocated the funds for schools from the state's sale of land, and the legislature would be responsible for supporting schools in each district for at least 3 months out of the year. A library was to be established in each township, and a fund for the establishment of universities would be secured. After 25 days in session, the Constitution was finalized and sent to Congress for approval. Iowa had been in a race with Wisconsin to create a constitution. Congress, after the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri, a slave state, was admitted along with Maine, a free state, to equal out the number of senators from free and slave states, the legislative body wanted to admit one free and one slave state into the Union each time to keep each side equal. Florida was hoping to be the next slave state admitted, but it needed a free state to go with it. Wisconsin was on the verge of a state constitution when Iowa submitted theirs. Therefore, Florida and Iowa would be approved for entry into the Union together. Florida would enter the Union in March of 1845, but the debate in Iowa was not done yet. Were they to admit the entire territory of Iowa into the Union, a territory that included the modern-day state of Iowa and the better part of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota? To give them such a large territory would promote the political dominance of the eastern states, who were smaller but carried just as much political power in the Senate with 2 senators from each state, so they decided to cut it down in size. Congress also looked to Iowa's inclusion into the Union as a way to stave off disunion or secession. Congressman Samuel Finley Vinton of Ohio made a speech explaining that disunion is ruin to them. They have no alternative but to resist it whenever or wherever attempted. That Massachusetts and South Carolina might, for aught I know, find a dividing line that would be mutually satisfactory to them, but sir, they can find no such line to which the western country can assent. Because of their connection to the north through railroads and their connection to the south via the Mississippi River, he argued that Iowa would fight to preserve the Union because it needed those economic partners. Now that the House and the Senate approved their admission, the people of Iowa had to vote on it, and by people I mean white adult males. They disliked having such a large section of their state cut off and made smaller, so they voted down the Constitution based on the size of the state proposed by Congress. However, they also disliked that the delegates supported public banks or banks run by the state or counties. They believed with too many restrictions that it would be impossible to have a bank that was solvent within the state and no one would invest in it. So the Constitution went down to defeat by the people. A convention of delegates met again in January 1846 to adopt a new constitution. First, they established that the state could not create a public bank. This appeased the Democrats in the convention. With that constitution approved by the delegates, it was then sent off to Congress to debate on the boundaries for the state. On August 3, 1846, Congress approved Iowa as a state and gave them the extra land that the people had requested after the defeat of the first Constitution. On December 28, 1846, President James K. Polk signed the bill admitting Iowa as a state. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this helps you understand the internal politics of statehood when it came to Iowa and how its entry played out on the national stage. If you join the Patreon page, you can vote for the next state to be covered. Thank you all again. Have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Half history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.